Jared Kushner occupied the witness seat, displaying the bearing of someone who had practiced for this position repeatedly, yet had never genuinely assumed it. His spine erect, palms resting on the desk, and digits intertwined in the
Joyous
specific
about the
stance
hostages coming
corporate
home and
trainers
the end to
instruct to
this
appear
long war
receptive
that
yet
nobody thought was
restrained,
possible. And Steve and I
broadcasting
were
effortless
panicking, saying,
tranquility.
what do we do next?
A
How do you
hide-covered
implement
journal
peace? And as you
rested
guys
shut
know,
before his
peace is a different
hands,
deal than
which
revealed
he
that
had
she
not
has no
unsealed and
intentions of
possessed no
answering
intention of
questions, but
unsealing.
instead I'm going to ask some
It
very
remained
basic
present
questions really
solely due
quickly of
to
my colleague,
obligation,
Becca
much like an
Ballin, if she will
organizer rests
answer right
upon
or
a
wrong
corporate
raping
boardroom desk,
children.
not intended for practical application but to imply its owner possesses a strategy. His tailored garments were dark blue, his neckwear slim, the knot meticulously formed, and his styling carried a price tag exceeding a typical individual's auto loan installments while appearing entirely inexpensive, which served as the exact objective. Every aspect concerning this individual was engineered to appear as a void, representing a complete lack of exertion and the theatrical display of unforced grace. He had maintained this act for such an extended period that it ceased being a theatrical display and simply became his identity, resembling a promotional magazine snapshot of a human being. On the opposite side of the chamber, Texas Representative Jasmine Crockett was organizing a pile of documents that appeared exceptionally massive, even when judged against the inherently bulky standards of legislative proceedings. This compilation contained distinct divisions and brightly hued markers, indicating the level of readiness that typically causes congressional staffers anxiety, as it signified her inquiries were drafted well in advance and the corresponding replies were already foreseen. Seated behind him in the subsequent tier, an attorney wearing a dark gray outfit rested with a yellow writing tablet and an ink instrument gripped akin to a blade, poised to hastily draft protests that would never be upheld within a legislative inquiry, given this environment was not a judicial setting and its regulations failed to shield the testifier as legal standards typically would. This legal counsel commanded a high premium, just as every single element surrounding this specific witness commanded a high premium. The distinction separating this chamber from every environment he customarily inhabited lay in the fact that wealth provided no advantage here. Currency could not soften the inquiries, finances could not accelerate the passing minutes, and capital could merely compensate the attorney, situated in the adjacent tier, while that attorney was restricted to merely occupying a seat. The space was crowded, not packed with demonstrators or spilling into the corridors, but rather experiencing the precise type of capacity reached when broadcast networks have advertised an inquiry for 3 consecutive days, while online communities have preemptively begun generating viral content regarding the legal summons. The congressional panel tasked with administrative accountability had designated this session as an examination of overseas sway and monetary entanglements among upper-level executive branch personnel. Every political insider in the Capitol understood that the use of a plural noun served merely as a polite fiction, since the inquiry focused exclusively on a singular figure. That individual occupied the central testifying desk, accompanied by a sealed journal and an expression that revealed absolutely zero information. The Congresswoman raised her gaze, stared straight toward her target, and offered the specific grin a litigator provides prior to their initial inquiry, an expression neither welcoming nor aggressive, but rather the smirk of an individual who dedicated nearly a month to readiness and intends to utilize every available second of their time. I appreciate your attendance today, sir, as I recognize your schedule is demanding and your investment firm requires active management. She halted briefly, noting that since the vast majority of your $3 billion currently remains parked in financial institutions without being deployed, perhaps the enterprise operates autonomously after all, though I remain grateful for your presence. Pausing a beat, the witness displayed no response, showcasing his primary talent for the blank expression, the identical look he maintained during executive branch updates, during upper chamber security reviews, and during media scrums where journalists questioned him regarding foreign adversaries while he deflected with remarks concerning domestic public works. This was the countenance broadcasting the message that he was present entirely by his own volition and preference. While the binding legal summons indicated a different reality, his visual demeanor wholly ignored the existence of that mandatory directive. I intend to commence our discussion exactly where your current trajectory originated, sir, specifically focusing on a singular commercial property and its corresponding street location. Allowing the silence to hang effectively, she named the Fifth Avenue Tower, constructing her narrative much like a prosecuting attorney establishes a chronological sequence for a panel of peers, laying each piece of masonry, each calendar milestone, and each financial figure methodically. Her vocal tone remained casual and borderline amiable, mimicking the cadence of someone clarifying a supposedly elementary concept that was poised to turn intensely intricate. During the year 2007, at 27 years of age, you persuaded your relatives to acquire this property for nearly $2 billion, establishing an unprecedented high-water mark for commercial metropolitan real estate, executing this maneuver at the absolute zenith of the property inflation era just prior to the most severe economic meltdown seen since the Great Depression. Flipping to the next document, she noted the structure rapidly transformed into a catastrophe, with nearly a third of the space empty and lease revenues paying only half the property loan, causing your relatives to hemorrhage funds monthly while anticipating massive upcoming debt maturation. A situation your personal historian described as an explosive device counting down, which represents his phrasing rather than mine. She directed her gaze toward the witness, and he returned her stare with an entirely vacant countenance. During the 2 years preceding your executive branch tenure, both you and your patriarch engaged in straightforward discussions with a former Middle Eastern premier regarding a $500 million salvation strategy aimed at restructuring debts to rescue the aforementioned skyscraper. She halted momentarily, ensuring the gallery fully absorbed the specific foreign nation's name, before noting that the arrangement collapsed and subsequently turning to a fresh sheet of paper. By the spring of the following year, following a quarter year of service as a top presidential counselor managing regional foreign relations, your patriarch, who held no government position and managed the clan's property enterprise, convened with that same nation's financial minister to propose funding for your struggling commercial tower. She paused, allowing the chronological chain to resonate so the audience could process the dynamic where the offspring dictates diplomatic strategies internally, while the patriarch solicits external capital from those identical foreign regimes, culminating in the targeted nation declining the request. Allowing a couple of heartbeats to elapse, she detailed how 60 days after this sovereign state denied funding to your relatives, neighboring kingdoms enforced a comprehensive political and commercial embargo against them. The chief American diplomat actively attempted to negotiate a resolution and desired a reduction in hostilities, as managing such international disputes represented his primary professional duty. Leaning closer, she emphasized that the commander-in-chief used social media to endorse the embargo, undermining his top diplomat, while various journalistic outlets verified that this cabinet member suspected the supporting statements were guided by a foreign envoy and funneled to the chief executive directly via your intervention. The legal representative positioned in the subsequent tier adjusted his seating posture, yet the primary witness remained perfectly still, his void expression functioning exactly as intended. Did you possess any knowledge, sir, that your patriarch actively pursued capital from this specific foreign regime for your flagship property concurrently with your formulation of governmental strategies impacting that exact same nation? Moving closer to the amplification device, he projected a hushed tone, a perpetual calculated gentleness forcing journalists to physically approach to comprehend him, fulfilling his core strategy that individuals who physically submit are simultaneously surrendering psychological territory. Congresswoman, my attention remained dedicated to the expansive diplomatic alliances between our Republican regional partners, meaning my executive branch duties operated completely independently of any commercial endeavors conducted by the family corporation, from which I had legally separated my assets. I possess the factual reply, sir, as 3 diplomatic bureaucrats informed investigative journalists that the cabinet secretary was kept almost entirely ignorant regarding your correspondence with the royal heir during that time frame, confirming you conducted unfiltered dialogues with this foreign leader, circumventing official diplomatic channels shortly after a rival nation denied your relatives funding. Drawing an additional record from her pile, she pivoted to the subsequent events of the following year, when a major investment firm executed a century-long rental agreement on your problematic tower, injecting over $1 billion and rescuing your relatives from fiscal collapse. Elevating the paper, she noted the investment firm originally insisted the previously mentioned foreign nation played no role in this bailout, broadcasting this narrative to media outlets until an international news agency uncovered that this sovereign wealth fund ranked as the secondary majority stakeholder in the precise corporate vehicle managing the rescue. The leading minority legislative official on the fiscal panel officially documented that the investment corporation's widespread guarantees had ultimately proven completely untruthful, using his exact terminology. Placing the record on the desk and clasping her palms, she summarized the chronology. A foreign state denies your property funding. You subsequently back an embargo against them contrary to official diplomatic guidance. The sanctions are ultimately removed, and subsequently that identical state utilizes a corporate proxy to deliver over $1 billion to salvage the property they initially rejected. Directing her focus to the witness, she inquired whether, in his expert judgment as an individual experienced in both property markets and federal administration, this specific chain of events appeared entirely accidental. The witness responded by insisting to the Congresswoman that he maintained zero participation in corporate operational choices during his administrative tenure, having liquidated his holdings in the skyscraper, and asserted that any attempt to link his public duties with private family enterprises represented a falsehood. You merely transferred your equity to your sibling and a private entity managed by your matriarch, the representative interjected, her vocal delivery utterly monotonous, resembling an individual simply reciting a financial invoice. The upper chamber's fiscal panel scrutinized this exact maneuver and determined it failed to represent authentic asset separation, and I concur with their assessment, because transferring assets to one's parent is not a genuine transaction but merely a cosmetic rebranding. The chamber grew entirely quiet, lacking the courteous quietude of standard political pageantry, but rather exhibiting the distinct stillness occurring when massive 10-figure sums crash into a gathering of individuals unaccustomed to such extreme wealth, who struggle to imagine a hemorrhaging skyscraper salvaged by a sovereign regime whose very foreign affairs are directed by the property owner's relative occupying federal office. The testifier altered his appearance in no way, representing his most disturbing characteristic. It wasn't merely his proficiency at concealing feelings, but rather the stark reality that he appeared to possess zero internal feelings requiring concealment. He had encountered this chronological narrative previously and retained legal counsel specifically to address it, rendering these facts mere ambient static within his existence, functioning like environmental climate control in a commercial structure, perpetually present yet entirely ignored. The complication arose from his current placement in an environment lacking such comfortable atmospheric controls as the Congresswoman flipped a sheet without rushing, having practiced her delivery exactly as her target practiced his seated bearing, exhibiting the exactitude of an individual understanding that tempo dictates impact and that unsaid pauses convey the profoundest significance. A major capital newspaper published findings during your ongoing executive branch tenure detailing how your deficit of administrative expertise combined with your massive commercial liabilities were viewed from the outset as vulnerabilities that overseas regimes might exploit to manipulate your actions. This framing does not originate from me, but rather stems from the publication referencing national security professionals, she noted while shutting the initial portion of her binder and shifting to the subsequent crimson-hued divider. Having concluded the property discussion, she proposed shifting the dialogue toward the Capitol itself, while on the far side of the chamber, a conservative staffer discreetly drafted a digital message beneath his desk. Several tiers backward, a wire service journalist ceased transcribing completely to observe the proceedings with abandoned writing implements, adopting the stance of someone recognizing the narrative was self-evident and that witnessing the target's visual reaction to the interrogation constituted the actual journalistic value. It was a visage displaying absolute zero, a countenance disciplined through intensive drilling, biological disposition, and decades of functioning as the wealthiest individual in any given space, which currently faced a rigorous trial by an organized representative possessing greater persistence than the witness possessed vacuity. Her vocal delivery shifted, avoiding increased volume since she consistently refrained from yelling when handling grave subjects, understanding that profound matters carry inherent weight and screaming merely cheapens their impact. The tone grew noticeably decelerated and frigid, mimicking a state litigator transitioning into an evidentiary phase concerning a deceased victim. "Sir, I wish to redirect our focus toward the Crown Prince," prompting the testifier to angle his skull fractionally as his vacant expression quietly adjusted itself. As he began claiming the royal leader served as a vital American geopolitical partner he felt privileged to assist, she interjected that this very leader boasted to a neighboring monarch that you were entirely under his control, using phrasing sourced from investigative reporting rather than partisan operatives to establish the royal's personal description of your dynamic. Without pausing for his rebuttal, she outlined how during his federal service, he corresponded with this royal figure utilizing a secured digital platform that effectively circumvented federal archival laws, diplomatic tracking protocols, and defense advisory oversight. A trio of diplomatic administrators informed investigative journalists that the cabinet secretary remained entirely oblivious to these exchanges, while your personal defense counselor lamented your tendency to hyper-manage regional strategies without ever updating the broader defense establishment. Flipping another sheet, she signaled an impending topic that every single individual present anticipated, leaving only the mystery of her specific rhetorical delivery. In the autumn of that year, a legally residing American media professional and Capital newspaper contributor entered a diplomatic facility in Turkey to secure marital paperwork, prompting her to halt for the most protracted silence of the inquiry thus far, before noting he never exited the premises. American intelligence agencies determined with extreme certainty that the royal heir independently commanded this assassination, leading to the writer being executed within the diplomatic building before his corpse was segmented utilizing a surgical cutting tool. She delivered that gruesome descriptive phrase regarding the physical destruction of the victim completely devoid of theatrical weight, tonal variation, or the manufactured hesitation an inferior interrogator might employ to generate artificial suspense. She articulated the gruesome details precisely as one states objective reality, understanding that horrifying truths require zero theatricality but merely clear verbalization into an amplification device before recording lenses, particularly while the individual who financially benefited from the slaughter rests mere feet distant beside his sealed journal. The entire chamber remained motionless, utterly lacking respiratory interruptions or document rustling, as the broadcast lens fixated upon the witness's entirely vacant expression. Based on numerous journalistic accounts and authoritative biographical reporting, your personal reaction to this assassination involved dismissing the writer's termination as merely minor behavioral errors committed by the royal leader. Allowing the dismissive phrasing to linger in the atmosphere, she noted that another author documented your characterization of the victim, ensuring she cited it flawlessly, as a violent extremist simply pretending to operate as a media professional. Releasing the document, she highlighted reporting indicating you transformed into the royal's primary internal advocate, counseling him on surviving the subsequent backlash, which pertained entirely to the crisis of public exposure rather than the moral crisis of orchestrating a lethal hit. Drawing a fresh sheet, she quoted the chief executive admitting on an officially recorded audio tape that he personally rescued the foreign leaders standing by successfully coercing the legislature to abandon their scrutiny. A pair of legislative measures designed to halt military weapons transfers to the kingdom gained approval across the political spectrum, yet the commander-in-chief legally blocked each initiative. Halting to allow the timeline's weight to accumulate, she noted that a mere half-year following your departure from federal service, you established an investment vehicle and secured a staggering sum of money from the kingdom's sovereign wealth apparatus, which is directly supervised by that exact same royal leader. She delivered the monetary figure deliberately, treating it as a sum-defying standard human understanding, articulating every phonetic beat so viewers observing remotely could internally process the magnitude of the wealth twice. The Sovereign Fund's Internal Review Committee, consisting of the kingdom's exclusive fiscal consultants, explicitly advised against authorizing this massive capital transfer. Their documented rationale cited the leadership team's lack of professional background, characterized the pitch as universally inadequate, and deemed the administrative compensation rates completely unreasonable. After the committee issued a denial, the royal leader individually bypassed their judgment to approve the transaction, she noted before raising her eyes to state that currently almost the entirety of your firm's backing originates from overseas regimes, lacking even a solitary domestic backer. You have deployed roughly a third of your amassed capital, leaving the vast majority idling uselessly in financial accounts, yet you have still harvested over $150 million in administrative charges, with more than half of that derived directly from the kingdom. Clasping her digits upon the desk, she demanded to know exactly what services warranted tens of millions in compensation from a regime verified by intelligence agencies as responsible for mutilating a domestic reporter, especially considering the capital remains entirely uninvested. The witness returned her gaze with his perpetually vacant expression intact, yet a subtle internal tension manifested exclusively through his woven digits squeezing together marginally tighter, a microscopic shift that, within his specific behavioral parameters, equaled an average person violently striking the furniture. He extended his arm toward the hydration vessel, consumed a minor swallow, and returned it to the surface. Within his operational framework, consuming fluids amid an interrogation represented a strategic maneuver designed to purchase several moments of delay while projecting an aura of completely unruffled tranquility. However, there existed an alternate iteration of this action completely devoid of tactical planning, which this instance represented, as he consumed the liquid strictly due to sudden oral dehydration. Congresswoman, my tenure within the executive branch was conducted with absolute moral rectitude, and I retain immense pride regarding the achievements we secured for the nation's citizenry. Seizing back her allotted schedule without awaiting the presiding officer's intervention, she forcefully interrupted him, a privilege secured by utilizing her segment to construct an evidentiary foundation rather than grandstanding. While the committee head remained silent, observing with the rigid demeanor of an official recognizing the interaction was actively achieving digital infamy. Sir, I intend to transition to the subject of how you initially secured authorization to view the Republic's most highly classified data, she stated while accessing a fresh Azure-marked division of her binder. Upon commencing your executive service, you filed the mandatory background questionnaire required of all individuals pursuing classified authorization, which specifically demands a roster of overseas acquaintances, yet you submitted that specific portion entirely empty. Leaving the term blank to resonate, she noted you subsequently blamed an assistant for an early filing, before updating the document a third of a year later with over 100 omitted international connections, which featured Moscow's top envoy and the head of an embargoed foreign financial institution. You proceeded to revise the application multiple additional times, eventually appending the mid-year gathering at your family's flagship skyscraper involving a foreign attorney linked to the adversary's government, an encounter you had previously hidden. Locking eyes with him, she emphasized that a pair of veteran executive security analysts, nonpartisan experts who dedicated their occupational lives to judging these precise documents, audited your dossier and explicitly advised against granting high-level authorization. Their anxieties centered on overseas manipulation, individual behavior, and commercial entanglements, yet a partisan official actively vetoed their professional judgment. Extracting a subsequent document, she noted the situation deteriorated further when the primary federal espionage organization, the very entity tasked with shielding the Republic's confidential data, audited your history and aggressively objected. An intelligence official telephoned the executive mansion demanding to know how you secured baseline authorization at all, resulting in the agency outright denying you entry to securely partitioned data, which represents the absolute pinnacle of classified material. Depositing the sheet, she recounted how the commander-in-chief individually commanded his primary administrative director to bestow the exact authorization the intelligence community had blocked. The military veteran serving as staff director drafted a private record confirming he was mandated to execute this action because, unlike his colleagues, he recognized that whenever a chief executive bypasses national security apparatuses to benefit a relative, a physical historical record must be generated. She halted briefly, reminding him that both he and his spouse appeared on broadcast media to explicitly reject claims of presidential interference, meaning both public declarations were entirely fabricated and deceitful. Shutting the Azure section, she stated that a veteran transparency advocate within the Executive Security Department provided sworn testimony revealing your specific file represented merely one among 24 instances where authorization was bestowed despite fierce resistance from lifelong analysts. Federal espionage bureaus pinpointed 4 distinct sovereign states, specifically a Gulf monarchy, an Asian superpower, a Middle Eastern ally, and a southern neighbor, that actively plotted to weaponize your commercial vulnerabilities to manipulate your actions. She stared at him, displaying the countenance of an individual preparing to utter an irreversible truth, declaring that when the primary intelligence bureau deems you unfit for state secrets, while multiple overseas regimes strategize your financial coercion, you represent the precise archetype the authorization framework was built to block from accessing confidential data rather than shelter. The witness consumed additional hydration, replaced the vessel, and utilizing his vacant expression, began repeating his assertion of honorable administrative service before being interrupted. You previously utilized that specific term regarding your honor, sir, and while I registered it and plan to revisit that exact phrasing shortly, I first intend to discuss your patriarch. The representative's vocal delivery morphed into a breezier, casual register, mimicking the cadence employed during an evening social gathering where the narrative climax remains undelivered, yet every listener senses its imminent arrival. This tonal pivot represented a calculated tactic. Following nearly half an hour of 10-figure financial sums, surgical dismemberment tools, and intelligence directives, she was providing the gallery a momentary psychological reprieve. The observers required this respite, as did the witness himself, though neither party realized this temporary relief merely functioned as a rhetorical trap. During the year 2005, sir, your patriarch formally admitted culpability to 18 national criminal charges involving revenue fraud, unlawful political donations, and interfering with legal testifiers. She halted briefly, allowing her remarkably casual delivery to render the subsequent details significantly more horrifying rather than less. The specific allegation regarding judicial interference entailed your patriarch discovering that his own relative by marriage was actively assisting national law enforcement agents. Reacting to this betrayal, your patriarch financed a sex worker to entice this relative into a roadside accommodation, orchestrated the covert filming of their interaction, and subsequently mailed the footage to his own sibling, the target's spouse, to violently coerce her against providing evidence to a national prosecutorial panel. The inquiry chamber manifested a uniquely profound stillness triggered whenever a detail proved so grotesquely elaborate and spectacularly vile that standard human responses, such as whispered comments, postural adjustments, and audible sighs, cease functioning completely. The conservative official who originally litigated this matter as the top federal prosecutor for that specific eastern state, and who eventually secured the governorship there, described this action precisely as among the most repulsive and vile infractions he ever handled during his prosecutorial tenure. The prosecutor subsequently appended that his career occurred within a jurisdiction historically recognized for severe corruption, indicating, sir, that your patriarch's transgressions were exceptionally severe even within an exceptionally corrupted environment. A solitary throat clearing echoed from the viewing area, but the space remained otherwise completely soundless. Following your patriarch's 14-month incarceration, you actively pursued vengeance against the public servant responsible for his imprisonment. During the former prosecutor's leadership of the Executive Transfer Committee, you systematically engineered his termination, a fact you have perpetually declined to refute. Flipping to another document, she maintained her remarkably casual vocal register. Following a chief executive clemency grant for your patriarch at the close of his term alongside other notorious political operatives, the newly returned president subsequently proposed your criminally convicted, license-stripped father to act as the primary diplomat to a major European ally, securing legislative approval by a narrow 6-vote margin. She stared at her target, whose expression remained entirely static, yet the atmosphere within the chamber visibly shifted, causing the space separating the testifying desk and the legislative dais to feel depressurized, like the environment preceding a massive meteorological event. Sir, prior to your application to an elite Ivy League institution, your patriarch gifted $2.5 million to that exact academy, and you subsequently gained entry. Administrators from your secondary educational facility informed journalists they felt genuinely astonished by your acceptance, specifically noting your scholastic achievements fell drastically short of the traditional benchmarks required for such prestigious collegiate enrollment. She elevated her palm, lacking any intent to interrupt the silent witness, but rather employing the gesture to indicate her compilation of facts was officially transforming into an extensive litany. Your elite collegiate education was outright purchased by your patriarch. Your executive branch authority was simply handed to you by your spouse's father. Federal legal authorities were forced to entirely overturn generations of regulations prohibiting familial favoritism merely to permit you and your wife to hold administrative positions. Your authorization to view classified intelligence was commanded by your spouse's father in direct defiance of the primary espionage agency's resistance. The massive influx of Gulf Kingdom capital occurred solely because the royal leader individually bypassed his personal fiscal consultants to authorize it. The absolute legal forgiveness granted to your patriarch was authorized via the signature of your spouse's father. The prestigious diplomatic posting awarded to your patriarch originated entirely from the nomination of your spouse's father. Placing her palms flush against the desk, she noted that while you and your wife disclosed external revenues reaching potentially hundreds of millions during your federal tenure, you simultaneously framed your refusal of a basic administrative paycheck as a noble personal hardship. Sir, that public compensation equated to a microscopic fraction of your existing revenue streams, rendering its rejection a mere accounting anomaly rather than a genuine charitable forfeiture. Locking eyes with him, she demanded to know if, throughout his entire professional trajectory spanning collegiate admissions through federal service to private equity, he could identify one solitary triumph not explicitly bought on his behalf by his patriarch, his spouse's father, or an overseas royal. The inquiry rested heavily within the chamber, resembling a massive weight slammed upon a surface with such terminal force that observers naturally stare at the impact site rather than locking eyes with their neighbors. The witness executed an action completely unprecedented throughout the entirety of the proceeding, providing a substantially protracted verbal response. Congresswoman, I retain immense pride regarding our achievements. The Middle Eastern diplomatic treaties established unprecedented truces between a key ally and neighboring states. Our legislative initiatives provided substantial penal code modifications, and our pandemic logistics operations secured vital health equipment. The representative's vocal interjection arrived peacefully rather than forcefully, carrying the distinct tranquility of an individual who anticipated this precise rhetorical opening. You explicitly referenced those Middle Eastern diplomatic treaties, so we shall now examine those specific diplomatic treaties. Shifting her weight forward, she clarified that the foundational participants in those international agreements heavily featured two specific Gulf monarchies. One represented the exact regime that funneled massive billions into your firm, while the other represented the precise state federal espionage agencies flagged for plotting to manipulate your fiscal weaknesses. You brokered geopolitical truces with the identical foreign powers that simultaneously enriched your personal accounts and strategized your psychological coercion. Angling her skull, she stated that such activity fails to qualify as statesmanship, sir, but rather constitutes a transactional billing receipt. An audible reaction rippled from the observers, lacking full comedic release but representing the sharp breath preceding amusement, a completely reflexive acknowledgement of a statement both catastrophic and accurate, where chuckling feels improper yet stifling it feels physically impossible. Proceeding to his claims regarding penal modifications, the representative noted they were theoretically motivated by his patriarch's incarceration. The identical patriarch later granted total clemency by his spouse's father, meaning the broader public received minor systemic tweaks while his immediate relatives received absolute legal absolution. Refusing to halt for audience feedback as her momentum escalated, she dismantled his pandemic logistics boast by highlighting how the initiative utilized public funds to import health resources only to permit corporate entities to peddle them for massive gains, a system a prominent senator officially branded as plagued by sluggishness, ineptitude, chaos, and concealment. She deposited her entire collection of documents onto the desk, abandoning the massive pile, the organizational dividers, and the vividly hued segments completely. She discarded these materials utilizing the identical finality a gambler employs when revealing a fundamentally unbeatable hand at the contest's conclusion. Sir, upon rigorous inspection, absolutely every triumph you previously heralded exhibits unmistakable traces of financial self-dealing, familial favoritism, or ethical breaches, meaning you possess entirely zero uncorrupted professional victories. The witness stalled briefly, merely a couple of heartbeats. Yet for an individual who perpetually operated with preloaded defensive jargon regarding his appreciation for inquiries or referring matters to legal advisors, this minuscule delay represented an absolute eternity. Those mere moments constituted the exact boundaries separating his vacant expression's functionality from its total collapse. He initiated his rebuttal using standard deferential pleasantries, prompting the Congresswoman to execute an unprecedented maneuver for this proceeding by aggressively interrupting him using a remarkably hushed, rather than amplified, vocal tone. The acoustic level plummeted alongside the metaphorical climate, compelling absolutely every individual present to unconsciously shift their posture marginally forward. Sir, I possess zero desire for your deference as I require factual replies, which you remain entirely incapable of providing, since the truthful response to my entire interrogation admits you exploited familial authority to extract massive wealth from overseas regimes, a reality you violently refuse to verbalize on broadcast media. She retrieved a singular piece of documentation from the surface. Sir, your patriarch faced incarceration for financing a sex worker to terrorize legal testifiers. You secured executive authority exclusively by wedding the chief executive's offspring, and you exited that administration holding vast billions from a Gulf royal, the identical royal verified by intelligence agencies as orchestrating the butchering of a reporter you subsequently labeled an extremist. She cast her gaze toward the hide-wrapped journal continuing to rest sealed upon the testifying surface, perpetually untouched and entirely vacant. Yet you occupy this seat accompanied by an upscale ledger you have refused to unseal for the duration of this inquiry, lecturing me regarding the concept of moral honor. Releasing the document, she noted that the butchered journalist is permanently deprived of testifying within legislative chambers, having been slaughtered and physically segmented with a surgical blade within a Turkish diplomatic facility, while you accepted massive fortunes from the architect of that horror and branded the casualty a violent extremist. She halted her delivery, causing the entire gallery to cease respiration entirely before demanding to know, between the two of them, who precisely qualified as the genuine terrorist. Stillness reigned as the witness declined to reply, not due to a lack of prepared rebuttals given he perpetually possessed defensive statements, legal counsel ready to interject, or at bare minimum heavily sanitized corporate jargon mimicking a legitimate response without actually providing one. However, this marked the initial instance where absolutely every conceivable verbalization represented a catastrophic error. Confirmation constituted a confession, denial constituted criminal deceit, and claiming amnesia regarding such massive 10-figure sums proved impossible because wealth of that magnitude permanently alters human cognition, occupying primary mental real estate much like a malignancy occupies physical tissue, perpetually present and relentlessly invasive. He remained seated, displaying his vacant expression, yet on this occasion the void failed to project tactical tranquility or the heavily drilled blankness of an extensively tutored operative. It genuinely resembled absolute zero, the stark, authentic emptiness of an individual lacking any defense while occupying a chamber entirely unwilling to provide him an escape route. The representative maintained this profound quiet for several heartbeats, refusing to disrupt the stillness with concluding remarks or theatrical verbal embellishments. Her final, devastating inquiry functioned as the ultimate concluding argument, while his sustained muteness served as the definitive reply. Following a sharp rap from the presiding officer's wooden mallet, the inquiry resumed as a pair of conservative lawmakers subsequently assumed their questioning segments, deliberately ignoring her explosive confrontation and entirely failing to shelter the witness. They posed mundane inquiries regarding investigative protocols and archival guidelines, representing the parliamentary equivalent of critiquing interior decorations while the structure actively incinerates. One of these officials, a sophomore representative who previously praised the witness extensively on financial television, squandered his entire allotted window interrogating a bureaucratic auditor regarding departmental messaging standards, deliberately avoiding eye contact with the primary target. Absolutely no individual rushed to his defense. Within a chamber managed by rival political leadership during an exhausting multi-hour solitary testimony, 0 participants utilized their speaking windows to dispute her narrative framing, challenge her chronological sequencing, or invalidate her staggering financial calculations. This utter lack of vocal support from presumed ideological partners functioned as its own damning evidentiary statement, prompting the Congresswoman to surrender her leftover clock and shut her binder. The ink instrument she had tucked beside her temple upon commencing the inquiry rested there completely unutilized, as she possessed absolutely no requirement to document fresh information, having perfectly memorized every detail within her files prior to crossing the threshold. That writing device represented a mere habitual prop rather than a functional implement, whereas the heavy binder constituted her true weapon. Declaring the return of her remaining minutes to the presiding officer, she rose gracefully without rushing and completely ignored the battered witness. The testifier departed the legislative complex utilizing an employee portal rather than the primary egress surrounded by a phalanx of broadcasting equipment, opting instead for a discreet delivery exit where an assistant had staged a darkened luxury sport utility vehicle. After his subordinate unsealed the passenger cabin, he entered the transport, actively avoiding backward glances and completely declining to provide any parting remarks. His mobile device, surrendered by the assistant as the massive vehicle accelerated from the sidewalk, displayed nearly 50 unchecked notifications, none of which he bothered to access. He stared through the glass toward the famous boulevard where sightseers photographed the massive structure he recently vacated, exchanging absolute silence with his subordinate, since within his specific echelon, lacking verbal interaction never constituted discomfort, but rather standard operational procedure. Within his operational reality, this humiliating display failed to qualify as a catastrophe because true catastrophes exclusively involve the destruction of capital. He possessed 0 history of destroying his personal wealth, having exclusively incinerated the capital of external investors while perpetually securing replacement benefactors to fund future endeavors. The kingdom's massive financial apparatus harbored 0 intentions of retracting their astronomical investments simply due to legislative theater, meaning his lucrative administrative payouts, his luxury transportation, and his profoundly vacant expression would all proceed uninterrupted. However, the digital broadcast snippet would simultaneously endure, and these viral segments functioned as a political commodity he severely lacked the capacity to control, since such media demands active engagement, whereas his entire professional philosophy relied upon absolute stony silence. By early evening, a prominent conservative television network launched its broadcast utilizing a lower third graphic, declaring that progressive lawmakers weaponized the administrative inquiry to unfairly slander the former official. The program's anchor branded the event a shameful ideological spectacle, showcasing liberal efforts to target private individuals via legislative authority, while a trio of pundits uniformly condemned the representative as incredibly rude, psychologically unstable, and obviously acting out solely for digital clout. The network aired a video snippet, specifically selecting her ultimate devastating inquiry regarding the true identity of the terrorist to illustrate her supposed incivility. Freezing the footage during the subsequent profound quiet, the anchor magnified the testifier's expression and explicitly praised his supposed stoicism, framing his total paralysis as an exemplary display of elegance amid aggressive hostility. By late evening, the most popular viewer response beneath the network's digital upload amassed massive approval by pointing out she merely posed a legitimate query regarding whether the butchered reporter or the individual accepting billions from his assassin, while smearing the casualty truly embodied extremism, demanding the release of the unedited footage. Another heavily endorsed reaction originated from a veteran espionage analyst claiming 2 decades of experience, noting that omitting over 100 international connections on a background document represents a deliberate strategy rather than an accidental error, adding that standard citizens face outright rejection and federal scrutiny for hiding merely a couple of interactions. A third highly rated response belonging to an expressly right-leaning military spouse declared complete apathy toward partisan gamesmanship, but immense concern for the slaughtered journalist, praising the congresswoman for verbalizing his identity, detailing his brutal demise, and confronting the beneficiary of his assassin's wealth with an unprecedented inquiry demanding the complete video. Thousands of miles away, within a modest Turkish flat still containing the literature the slain writer abandoned on his shelving prior to entering the diplomatic facility for marital paperwork, texts he fully anticipated reading that very evening and throughout their envisioned future together, his surviving fiancée viewed the digital footage on her portable computer. She observed the recording a second time, freezing the playback exactly as the representative described his lethal dismemberment via surgical tools, bringing her palm to her lips not to stifle weeping as her capacity for tears had long been entirely exhausted. She had previously sobbed openly across public plazas, within media studios, throughout international legislative corridors, and upon the staircases of the American Capitol, weeping until the act transformed into a basic biological necessity akin to respiration, simply representing the automated reality of surviving in a reality where her partner was downgraded from a human into a geopolitical complication, eventually fading into a mere historical caveat brushed off by broadcast pundits as minor behavioral errors. Rather than shedding tears, she maintained intense focus. Recognizing this marked the initial occurrence across over a half-decade of official inquiries, global tribunals, and fluctuating media frenzies, where an individual explicitly linked the staggering financial sum and her slaughtered partner's identity within a single breath, staring aggressively at the recipient of that blood money surrounded by broadcasting hardware beneath the emblem of the Republic. Shutting the digital device without distributing the video online, she remained seated amidst his undisturbed literature and the filtering sunlight, engulfed by the agonizing, distinct quietude of an environment profoundly haunted by an eternal absence. Within a partitioned workspace inside a bureaucratic facility situated in a Capitol-adjacent suburb, a veteran civil servant boasting decades of tenure within the National Defense Intelligence apparatus viewed the broadcast segment amid his midday meal. Having spent his complete professional existence auditing authorization paperwork, he possessed a history of rejecting candidates for omitting solitary overseas interactions or providing fragmented fiscal records, even outright disqualifying a heavily decorated military officer, boasting 3 decades of flawless deployment simply because the soldier neglected to document one brief conversation with an international citizen during a Swiss symposium. Following the military veteran's formal protest of the rejection, the institutional review upheld the denial, proving the bureaucratic machinery operated correctly. Observing the representative highlight the primary espionage agency's resistance, he affirmed the reality, reflecting upon the massive volume of dossiers he had processed, belonging to countless citizens who truthfully populated their extensive background forms yet endured agonizing protracted evaluations, terrified that a minor international vacation or an immigrant university acquaintance might jeopardize their clearance. He contemplated the highly competent, fundamentally decent applicants who suffered rejection despite never deliberately obscuring a massive roster of foreign operatives while conveniently blaming administrative staff for the supposed oversight. His mind shifted to this specific testifier occupying an executive branch suite holding the Republic's absolute most highly guarded daily intelligence digest, despite the premier espionage bureau explicitly forbidding such access until the commander-in-chief forcefully mandated it, prompting a horrified chief administrator to draft internal documentation establishing a permanent historical record of the corrupt intervention. Concluding the bureaucratic apparatus functions flawlessly for all citizens excluding modern royalty, he concluded his meal, returned to his workstation, and accessed the subsequent pending dossier belonging to a junior military officer who meticulously documented every international connection, foreign journey, and major fiscal movement precisely as instructed, delivering the absolute transparency the framework demands from the general populace. The legislative chamber now stood completely vacant as the ceiling illumination systematically powered down in a cascading sequence typical of the massive congressional structure once the final employees departed, allowing the custodial teams to arrive with their equipment, completely apathetic to the monumental rhetoric recently exchanged within that space. Resting atop the testifying desk, the upscale hide-wrapped journal remained exactly where its owner abandoned it after transporting it into the space earlier that day, treating the object as a mere corporate visual cue rather than a functional implement. He deliberately failed to retrieve it upon departure, and whether this omission represented genuine forgetfulness or the intentional discarding of a theatrical prop akin to abandoning a playbill following a recital remained his exclusive secret as he traversed the Capitol Highway within his luxury transport, entirely unconcerned regarding the ledger. The object lingered on the surface securely shut exactly as it remained throughout the exhaustive inquiry, untouched previously and destined to remain untouched. Come daybreak, the sanitation staff would inevitably deposit it within a subterranean collection bin for misplaced items, abandoning it beside discarded spectacles, administrative credentials, and branded hydration vessels, where it would languish indefinitely without retrieval. The interior of this journal contained absolute zero, lacking defensive strategies, conversational anchors, chronological refutations targeting the representative, or basic contact information, offering merely pristine, highly priced, ivory-tinted sheets designed exclusively to project an aura of profound gravity by an individual entirely unwilling to record actual thoughts. It perfectly mirrored his massive private equity fund, fundamentally vacant internally, featuring parked capital achieving absolutely nothing as administrative charges continuously multiplied, just as it mirrored his elite curriculum vitae featuring a purchased collegiate degree, an inherited executive title, and a royal-funded investment vehicle, presenting a magnificent exterior that immediately crumbled into utter hollowness the moment one searched for an unpurchased achievement. It resembled his perpetually vacant expression, highly manufactured and tightly regulated to broadcast capable tranquility, which, the instant the inquiries grew excessively precise, the financial figures grew excessively massive, and the slaughtered reporter's identity lingered excessively long, revealed itself as precisely the absolute void it always represented. The journal rested in the blackness of the vacant chamber while digital platforms endlessly looped the viral confrontation, while a grieving fiancé inhabited a Turkish flat filled with undisturbed literature, while a federal analyst processed background dossiers exactly as the bureaucratic framework demanded, and while a darkened luxury vehicle transported an expressionless individual possessing immense wealth yet zero justifications toward his impending future. Naturally, the physical ledger remained entirely ignorant of these sprawling realities, existing merely as a highly priced, hide-wrapped, stubbornly sealed object. Yet somewhere an entity continued surrendering hundreds of millions in administrative compensation simply for the exclusive honor of grasping such profound emptiness.